Good morning. I've got 3 recitals for you beforehand, stealing this from the lawyers. First is, as somebody from the US, I'm always aware of the fact that you all in Europe know how to build great, walkable, urban, vital places far better than we do. And we've been learning from you for decades. And of course, on our side of the pond, that we basically destroyed our center cities in the late 20th century, consciously. And we ran out to the drivable suburban places, which unfortunately you've also picked up on. But it's we'll be talking about the difference between these two. But I will mention that the US is doing one thing that is somewhat unique, somewhat different, and that is we've been engaging in the urbanization of the suburbs that I'll be talking about today. Number 2 is that I've owned and run 2 different SMEs. For 20 years, I ran what became the country's largest real estate advisory firm and sold that to get into real estate development, which the firm is a new urbanist downtown revitalization firm. We've done about 17 projects throughout North America. But I'm not opposed to large firms, even though both of these firms were under 100 employees. And I basically view large firms as successful small firms of 20, 30 years ago that are just waiting to be made obsolete by another rising small firm. So the giants of today, such as Amazon and Apple and Google and Philips, are just waiting to be taken out by the next generation of small, successful SMEs. And the 3rd recital is, I am really sorry about Donald Trump. Please apologize. We apologize profusely. I view this as an epidemic that has to burn itself out, somewhat like the Luddites back in the early 19th century. So I think you're obviously dealing with that here as well. So I'd like to start by talking about how the knowledge economy has changed everything and what's coming next, and how it's changing the market demand for what we refer to as walkable urban development. And it is both urbanizing the suburbs as well as redeveloping our center cities, and I'll give you an example of all places, Center City, Detroit. One of the things that many of us in this field have gotten stuck on is this concept of city versus suburb, meaning 2 different locations. And that's because the data sets are generally city versus suburbs. So we end up with what I think is now a pretty obsolete way of looking at our metropolitan trends. And the thing that started this all off, as far as the movement out to what we refer to as drivable suburban, is because of the underlying industrial economy. And this vehicle up here, you may or may not know that back in the peak of the industrial era, that 45% of all jobs in the US and here were directly or indirectly relating to the raw material going into the manufacturing of, the fueling, the insuring, the financing, building roads for the automobile. So this is how we made ourselves wealthy. This is how China is making itself wealthy today. We used to have a little jingle that the car maker Chevrolet, part of GM, had, which was "See the USA in your Chevrolet." And as we built more of this car accessible only places in our metropolitan areas, we made ourselves wealthier. So it made sense that we built this new way of building drivable suburban, because it made us wealthy, because we had to drive cars to get there. So how many of you know the movie Back to the Future? Good, about all of you. 1985, I propose to you that this is the most important popular urban movie ever. I cannot back that up, but you have to judge for yourself. This movie looked at the two ways of building the built environment: walkable urban and drivable suburban. Those are the only two options. And it's also set in three different time periods: 1955, 1985, and in the near distant future. And it demonstrates both of those ways of building in three different time periods, and it nailed it. The writers of the movie nailed it. So this first scene shows downtown Hill Valley in 1955, when it was a vital, vital place. So this idyllic downtown, Trento, with a plaza, retail on the ground floor, office, residential up above, a lovely civic structure. This is pretty idyllic, and you could get there by car, truck, bicycle, walking, or if you were Michael J. Fox, you would get there on skateboard. But now fast forward to 1985, downtown Hill Valley, and it's a different story. Can you play it? So X-rated movie theaters, homeless sleeping on the street. Behind the homeless is a surface parking lot that used to be the plaza, and great vacancy in the downtown. We had completely disinvested in this place. So where did he go? He went out to the regional mall. This is where the action was. So this is, business parks, regional malls, strip malls. This is where most of the economic vibrancy of that small town moved. So this explains how the US, and to a lesser extent here in Europe, much of the vitality moved out to the beltways that began to circle our cities. The first beltway, the second beltway. In Houston, it's now working on the fourth beltway, which is going to be 120 miles in circumference once it's finished. And pretty much this kind of development is the same as the third beltway outside of Paris. So it's this drivable suburban kind of development, which is very low density. It basically has a floor area ratio of between 0.05 and 0.4, and all different land uses are segregated from one another, and the only way to get between one versus the other is by the car or truck. Nobody would be foolish enough to walk it, and transit doesn't work. Walkable urban, on the other hand, much higher density, 4, 5, 40 times more dense, and that the FAR starts at 1.0, can go up. Generally, it's built out at 2, 3, 4 FAR, but in the case of Midtown Manhattan, it's 40 FAR. All examples of walkable urban places. So I would suggest that all of our research shift to focus on these two types of ways that we build: walkable urban versus drivable suburban, and that walkable urban takes place both in our center cities and in our urbanizing suburbs. Drivable suburban also takes place in our cities and in our suburbs. So that when we look at city versus suburb, what we're really doing is comparing apples to oranges. We need to be comparing apples to apples. And I'll show you an example in just a second. So now we're moving, we obviously have moved into the knowledge economy. And the knowledge economy is demanding a different way of building. It's much more demanding, walkable urban development. So much so that there's pent-up demand that we think is going to take 20 to 30 years to catch up with. And we think that the next economy to layer on top, the experience economy, is demanding the exact same thing. So Back to the Future nailed it as well. This is the near distant future. He comes back to downtown Hill Valley. It's completely renovated. The older buildings have been rehabbed. Some of them have been torn down and turned into much higher density. That the writers got this, they just nailed it. They got everything right except one thing, which is flying cars. They always promise us flying cars. We never get them. Not that I necessarily want them. And when was the near distant future? October 21st, 2015. So can you imagine in 1985 making a forecast that 30 years in the future, the American center city would be back? And it is in most metro areas. And it is, and as I had mentioned, it is going to take 20, 30 years to catch up with the pent-up demand that we have embedded in the marketplace right now. So when you look at the long wave of how we're building our economy, and I've referred to this before, we start, of course, with agriculture. Back in the 18th and in the early 19th century, 90% of our forebears were working on farms. By 1960, it was down to 9% working on farms. Today, it's about 1% working in agriculture. Yet the U.S. agricultural sector is the most productive in the world, well, certainly the largest, and it is just doing this with far fewer workers. When you look at mining and also manufacturing, you can see that the peak was pretty much in 1960. 28% of us worked directly in factories or in mines. But today, it's down to about 8.5%. So basically, 10% of us now feed us and produce the manufactured goods that we need. So what do the rest of us do? One thing that we've always done is, of course, retail trade, transportation, utilities, maintaining the baseline so that we can build the economy. And that's been pretty much steady for decades at about 25% of all employment. When you look at the experience and service economy, that's been rising, and that's now at about 15%. We expect that to take a shot up and will become a major component of the next long wave in the economy. So what have we been doing, of course, is the knowledge economy. Now, over 50% of all jobs are in the knowledge economy. And we expect that to peak and begin to drift downward as the experience economy layers on top. So this is not as if farming has gone away, it's just become more productive. Manufacturing has not gone away, it's become more productive. The same thing will happen with the knowledge economy, and the next growth industry, again, we are guessing, will be the experience economy. One of the best examples of that is Apple stores. So Apple stores, when they started 10 years ago, everybody thought that Steve Jobs was crazy. He was coming out with, that he was forward integrating into retailing from being a computer manufacturer. And 10 years ago, Disney stores were beginning to flatline and beginning to decline. Here's Disney, one of the best merchandisers on the world, and they were beginning to falter. So here, Apple Store comes along. And just so I can give you a metric that most retailers judge themselves on a sales per square meter basis. And the sales per square meter basis is that if you're a department store, you're looking for about $5,000, 6,000 euros per square meter of sales per year. If you're a grocery store, you want to have about $10,000, 11,000 euros per square meters per year. If you're a jewelry store, which is a very small item that sells in a very small space, but it's highly expensive, you're looking for sales per square meter of between $15,000 and $20,000 per square meter. So the range is roughly 500 or 5,000 per square meter to 20,000 per square meter. Apple Store shows up, and they're doing between 60,000 per square meter and 100,000 per square meter. I used to pole vault as a kid, and the world record in pole vaulting is 21 feet, so about 5 meters. No, 6 meters, 6.5 meters, almost 7. And my math is not so good today. And that would be as if somebody today came out and pole vaulted 100 meters. That's not pole vaulting, it's a different sport. The experience economy, what Apple did is that they took the lowest value worker, the clerks, and turned them into computer consultants. And I'm sure you've been in Apple stores, and they're just jammed with people getting computer advice and buying more and more Apple products. That's just one example of many. Obviously, tourism is part of the experience economy. And our numbers show that about 60% of tourism wants to be in walkable urban places. When somebody comes to Paris, they come to downtown Paris. Obviously, the tragedy of last night is an incredible thing to behold, but we know Paris is Paris, and it will always be there. But when people go to Paris, they don't go to the regional malls on the third beltway outside of Paris. They go to the walkable urban Paris. So we've been doing national surveys in the US looking at the 30 largest metros and ranking them based upon which ones are the most walkable urban and how do they perform from an economic and from a social equity point of view. And what we found is that there's a tremendous price premium for walkable urban space that did not exist 20 years ago. That in the income real estate products of office, retail, and multifamily housing, there's a 72% price premium on a price per square meter basis as far as the rent on an annual basis. When you add the capitalization rate, the cap rate premium, that jumps that premium up to over 100% on a price per meter basis. That the consumer is willing to pay twice as much in rent for a walkable urban place than for drivable suburban. So much so that we're beginning to see business parks in the US tank. They are more and more selling at a discount rate to their price 10 years ago, a discount of 80%. You're buying these business parks now 20 cents on the dollar. We're seeing the premiums of 90% in office space, 71% in retail, and 66% in multifamily rental. In nearly all the metros of those top 30 metros, which by the way is about 60% of the GDP of the country, that those premiums have continued from 2010 through 2015. By the way, we are just updating this data right now. It'll be out in late June. And all of these walkable urban product types are gaining market share, that they're growing much faster than their base in 2010. So much so that they are gaining market share anywhere from 77% faster than 2010 to 4 times faster in our metropolitan areas, which means that drivable suburban is losing market share. And the last time we saw one of these product types gaining market share and the other losing market share was back in the 1980s when it was going the other direction. What this is indicating is there's huge pent-up demand for this. So here are the 30 metros on this a scatter plot table, that the ones on the right, the 6 that are the most walkable urban, such as New York and Washington, D.C., and Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, Chicago, Boston, that those 6, when you compare them to the lowest 7, which are on the left-hand side, such as Phoenix and Orlando, what we found is that the per capita GDP, which is on average about $57,000 per person, so about 60,000 euros per person, per capita, on average, that the 6 highest ranked have a GDP per capita of 72,000 versus the lowest ranked walkable urban places that have a GDP per capita of 48,000. That's a 49% GDP per capita premium in the walkable urban places. To give you a comparison, that's the comparison between between Germany's GDP, which is the highest here in the EU, and those economic stalwarts, Russia, Croatia, and Romania. It's a first world, second world difference in how well the walkable urban metros are performing versus the drivable suburban metros. So the thing that we do, and I would urge you to consider, is that we look at metropolitan areas using 2 factors. One is walkable urban versus drivable suburban. And by the way, that involves drawing the walkable urban places. You cannot use existing data sets. That you have to get down to the alley level and draw on your GIS base maps where these walkable urban places are. We use walk score and employment density and then we go into the field and ground truth it to make sure we have it, because nobody has this kind of mapping. If you rely upon postal codes or rely upon census, you're going to get the wrong, generally too large of a geographic area, and you're going to be blending apples and oranges. So we divide the world into walkable urban, drivable suburban, and then we look at whether it's regionally significant, that is where we create the wealth. We're in a regionally significant place right now where we're sitting, versus a local serving place, which is a bedroom community. So we have a simple 4-cell matrix, and we drop all real estate, all land use, into those 4 cells. And the surprising thing is that the walkable urban places that are getting these huge price premiums of over 100% on a price per square foot, price per square meter basis, they only occupy between 2 and 5% of the total metropolitan landmass. That's it. So here's how it lays out in Washington. So the line there, the circle is the Beltway, the infamous Washington Beltway, and that we have 55 walkable urban places that are regionally significant. We, for short, call them walk-ups. And they start in the center city with our, what we in the US, of course, call downtowns, Centro, here. And then we have downtown adjacent places. And this is one of the most exciting places, because most of these places did not exist as far as an economic generator 20 years ago. They surround the downtown with a lower density, different character, different economic drivers, but they are exploding with growth all throughout the downtown in a 360 degrees manner. Then we have urban commercial. These are places that are not within walking distance of downtown, not influenced by downtown, but they have their own special character, that they have evolved and they've come back from the decline that they suffered in the mid-century to the latter part of the 20th century. There's also urban universities. Urban universities have been incredibly great anchors for walkable urban places, for these walk-ups. That started with the University of Pennsylvania. And by the way, since most of you are connected with a university, that it has been driving urban universities up in the rankings. So the University of Pennsylvania, 20 years ago, was ranked in the major ranking services about 18th or 19th in the country. Today, now that they've embraced their community rather than turning their back on the community, and they have created great urban vitality around the university, and the universities blend it into the community, that their rankings are 5th, 6th, or 7th. Almost all of the universities in the US that have risen in the rankings have been walkable urban universities. And the reason is that Penn 20, 25 years ago was dangerous. It was in West Philadelphia. And who would send their 18-year-old daughter to West Philadelphia 20, 25 years ago? Today, it's the hippest place in the city with the highest rents in the entire state. But now we move out to the suburbs. And this is crucial to understand this particular trend that we're tracking. And we start with suburban town centers. These are 18th and 19th century towns that were not part of the metropolitan area when they were founded, but they were laid out before the automobile. So they had a walkable urban fabric, they had historic buildings, and they all went downhill economically in the late 20th century. Now they're back because of the walkable urban character that is embedded in these buildings. Then the big change over the next 20 years is going to be the redevelopment of drivable suburban places, edge cities, regional malls, business parks. As I mentioned, they're tanking. We're going to lose 30% of all of our regional malls in the next recession. They're going to go dark. They're going dark already. Not all of them are going to go dark, but a good chunk of them will. They need to be recycled, or at least they can be recycled. And the number 37 out there is the largest edge city in the US, Tysons. The property owners 12 years ago, taxed themselves $1 billion to bring the metro rail out to Tysons. And today, Tysons is a forest of cranes around those metro stations, because Tysons was heading downhill 10, 15 years ago. Today, they are coming back as a walkable urban place. And then finally, greenfield and brownfield developments. We don't need as many of that in this country, in my country, as say China does, because we have so much already urbanized land that we don't have to go out to the fringe and urbanize greenfields. So these 55 places are, in this real estate cycle from 2010 until today, 92% of all office space went to those 55 places. Those 55 places make up 1% of the total land mass in the region. Those 55 places absorbed 82% of all multifamily housing and 73% of all new retail delivered in this cycle. In essence, sprawls over in those product types in metropolitan Washington. And here's the metro system that we continue to expand, and now putting a lot of emphasis on the maintenance of it. And 80% of of those 55 walkable urban places are rail transit served. That says two things. One is, of course, rail transit really helps promote a walkable urban place. But number two, it says that the 20% that do not have rail transit, they still work. So it's not impossible to pull off walkable urbanism in the suburbs without transit. So here are the four types of walkable urban places that are in the center city, including urban universities. And of course, urban universities that go big are now innovation districts. That's what MIT has done in Cambridge. That's what WashU and St. Louis University has done in urban St. Louis. That's what HQ1 in South Lake Union has done in Seattle, creating innovation districts, commercializing the research coming out of the urban university and keeping that employment base within walking distance. So, and then moving out to the suburbs, again, town centers, redevelopment of drivable suburban places, and greenfield developments. So here are the price premiums for metropolitan Washington for various product types. So on the income product types, starting with hotels, 88% price premium, multifamily, 37%, office, 52%. On top of that, you need to put the cap rate premium, which is another 30-40% that compounds that. So now most of those product types are over 100% price per square foot, price per square meter valuation premiums. And housing is 119% price per square foot, price per square meter premium. People are willing to pay more than twice as much for a walkable urban housing unit on a price per square foot basis than they are if it's a drivable suburban place. One of the things that we found is that all those McMansions that we bought in the 80s and 90s, they are now in surplus, that in the best suburban housing districts, those places are selling for about $2,000 per square meter, and they're going to take a year or more to sell. Walkable urban housing starts at $4,000 per square meter and goes up to $15,000 per square meter. They are two different markets altogether. They do not overlap. So as I say, a lot of this is taking place in the suburbs. Now, what we found in DC is that 49% of the total square footage of a new development that's walkable urban has gone to the center city, and 51% has gone to the urbanizing suburbs. That's because most of the people that are living in our metropolitan regions live in the suburbs. They have all their friends in the suburbs. They work in the suburbs. They have their clubs in the suburbs. And if they're going to move, they're primarily going to move to the urbanizing suburb close to their single-family house. But they better do it soon, because they're going to have a hell of a time selling those McMansions that are just sitting on the market. So here's an example, one of the best examples of the urbanizing suburb, in fact, the best example in the world, as far as I can tell, is Arlington County, which is a small county, tiny county, 23 square miles, across the river from Washington. So it's an inner suburban place. They have 8 different walk-ups in Arlington County, representing 11% of their landmass. So it's a very high percentage of their landmass is walkable urban. And they have consciously set a strategy to create walkable urban places around their transit stations. And they've been at this for 40 years. They were pioneers. That's why we can learn so much from Arlington. This picture here shows one of those now walkable urban places back 25, 30 years ago. This is a shot of the then closed Sears store, one of those large companies that are now being put out, that is almost out of business, being put out of business by smaller companies that have come along. That's the big box on the left, which is empty. On the right was the garden center, and where this picture was taken from is where you get your car fixed and you buy new tires. They moved out 25, 30 years ago. This is the same perspective today. And what you're looking at is obviously a plaza, the Apple Store, Whole Foods Organic Market, a bunch of other restaurants, and for sale housing up above. Incredibly vital place. And just 2 blocks north and south of this location, it feathers back to historic single-family homes. And those single-family homes are the most expensive housing in Arlington. Why? Because they have the best of 2 worlds. You can live in suburban splendor and walk to 50 restaurants and the metro station. So you have the best of 2 worlds. The other thing which is fascinating is that this 11% of land back in the 1980s generated 20% of the county's tax base and going down, as you can see in the picture in the upper left. Increased vacancy, property values went down, tax revenues went down. Today, it generates 55%. That 11% of the land generates 55% of their tax revenues. In the US, generally speaking, 70% of local tax revenues go to schools. And that's a good news, bad news story, of course, mainly bad news. But in this case, because of the walkable urban concentration, that growth in walkable urban places has meant that the school district, which is immigrant-based, by the way, there are 80 different languages spoken in the Arlington County schools. They are among the best schools in the country. And the reason that it works this way is that all those people in those rental apartments and townhouses and condos, they move to Arlington and they pay their taxes, and 70% of those taxes go to schools, and then they forgot to have kids. That the child generation, the school-age child generation rate of those condos is 1/8 that of the single-family housing. So there's no reason to fear the condos and multifamily housing. In fact, it's to attract them because they're going to be generating tax revenues and they're going to be improving your public schools. So in the suburbs, we're seeing this throughout the country. And again, Washington's the best model of this phenomenon. So here is Bethesda, which was pretty much a farm-to-market town back 50 years ago. Then it went downhill economically, was pretty much high vacancy, not much activity as far as economic activity going on. But today, it's a bustling, booming, lovely, walkable urban place. Lisa and I live in Center City, Washington, but we many times go out to Bethesda because it's just a different restaurant scene, different movie scene. We have 4 different friends that live in suburban housing within walking distance of these places, living in those best of 2 worlds type of housing. The picture in the upper left-hand corner, 25 years ago, that was a drive-through fast food restaurant. Today, it's a Twin Towers that are getting $550 per square meter rent in the suburbs. Here's one that just started. This is somebody who's on my board at George Washington University. This is a drivable suburban redevelopment in Fairfax County, about 20 miles west of Center City, Washington, D.C. It was a 14-plex movie theater surrounded by a huge surface parking lot. It was bulldozed. A grid of streets was put in by this developer. A Target, one of the big box stores, goes into a multi-level big box center. A new movie theater shows up there. Townhouses, rental apartments. This is now the center city for that portion of Fairfax County. So all of this is being driven by agglomeration. We heard about this yesterday. This is what's driving this. And it's the knowledge economy demanding agglomeration. So I liken agglomeration to an upward spiral of value creation. And if you're not getting 2, 3, 4, 5 benefits for every one policy step, for every one project that you develop, you're doing something wrong. Because agglomeration starts this upward spiral, this virtuous cycle. And that's because of the co-location of businesses in these walkable urban places, both the center city and the urbanizing suburbs, that start this upward spiral. It leads to increased productivity, GDP growth, and interestingly, I didn't show you this, but we found that the most socially equitable places in our country today are also the most walkable urban, in spite of those price premiums. Why? Because those low-income households are spending much less of their household income on transportation, and they have accessibility to 2, 3, 4 times more jobs if they live in a walkable urban place. A drivable suburban household is spending 25% of their household income on transportation. The vast majority of that is for a fleet of cars to participate in society. If you're in a walkable urban household, your spending on transportation on average drops from 25% to 9%. That 16% delta is worth hundreds of billions of dollars per year in spending. And that spending stays in the metropolitan region. The spending on cars leaves the region. It goes to Stuttgart, it goes to Tokyo, it goes to Detroit, or to Venezuela, our friends down in Venezuela, or Saudi Arabia. So it's a tremendous economic boost, both to low-income families and to the region as a whole. And you all know how agglomeration works. And of course, you probably know Paul Krugman, the American economist that also writes for the New York Times. He won his Nobel Prize based upon agglomeration theory. And he was asked once, what's the proof of this theory? And he said, very simple, it's cities. And it's because you have the ability to have easy knowledge transfer. As you bump into people on the street, bump into people as you're going to lunch or going to the coffee shop, you have access to labor. New firms want to hang around larger, older firms to pick off their high-value people, or if the new business is coming out of the larger firm, they're going to locate close by. They also want access to the suppliers and markets, which are more and more in the walkable urban places themselves, and the market itself. Particularly the millennials, but the knowledge workers in general are demanding walkable urban places. So here's a case study that I'll close on, which is looking at downtown Detroit. I've been working in downtown Detroit for about 20 years, and this is a case study of the Rock Ventures family of companies, which is best known for its leading company, Quicken Loans, which was, in 2007, when I got to know them, the 7th or 8th largest mortgage loan originator in the country. And they had about 800 workers in 2007. I laid out for downtown Detroit in 2007 a strategy to turn around downtown Detroit, working with the Downtown Detroit Partnership. This was in partnership with the University of Michigan and Brookings, the think tank. And I released it at the annual meeting of the Downtown Detroit Partnership, about 1,000 people. We laid out how the strategy was going to be implemented on the ground in downtown Detroit. And this fellow comes up to me afterwards in blue jeans, tatty shirt. Turns out he was the CEO of Quicken Loans, Rock Ventures. And he started talking to me about, well, gee, I'm thinking about moving my company downtown, I'm out in a bunch of business parks in the suburbs. But last summer, I asked my son, who went to the University of Michigan, during the summer, would you like to work for your old man? And his son replied quickly, hell no. Who wants to work in a business park? And he said, well, hell, if I can't get my own kid to work for me, I'm in big trouble. So he started thinking about moving into downtown Detroit. And what he did is that by 2010, he moved his company into downtown, 3 years later. At that point, it was about 2,500 workers. And over the 6 years, from 2011 to 2016, he invested $8 billion in downtown Detroit and in his businesses. So from an economic impact point of view, about 51% of it was for salaries, and 34% was for local services, buying legal advice and buying things from vendors, and 11% was for real estate assets. He ended up buying 100 buildings very cheaply, because downtown Detroit at that point was in fact heading for bankruptcy. And they eventually declared bankruptcy in 2013, after he had moved downtown. So of that $8 billion, he generated $18 billion of gross economic activity over that 6-year period. $9 billion going to the labor force, $13 billion of value added, $18 billion of total output. And it's interesting how the output of that was spread between the direct effects, the indirect effects, but the important one is that yellow on the top of the bar chart. That's the agglomeration-related effects. So on an annual basis, in 2016, he was generating $3.7 billion worth of economic activity, and see if I can see that number, 923 million of it was agglomeration. So how's that show up? Well, first, of course, take a look at the economic impact in the region. That his economic impact, 3.7 billion, is on the left. Motor vehicle transmission and powertrain parts generates 2.4 billion. Truck transportation, 2.4 billion. Local education, 2.4 billion. And architectural and engineering services, 2.1 billion. They created a whole new segment of economic activity that's larger than many of the more established activities that, of course, Detroit's known for. And what we also found as far as agglomeration is that every private sector worker in Detroit, in the city of Detroit, whether they worked for Rock Ventures and Quicken Loans or didn't, whether they were indirectly or directly affected by them, every worker got on average a $1,900 per year pay increase over the last 5-6 years since Quicken Loans came to town. That's agglomeration. That's the upward spiral, bidding up people's services as there's more demand for those services. The economic impact is now that Quicken Loans is now 0.3% of the total state's GDP, 1.3% of its county's GDP, and 33% of that is agglomeration. The fiscal impact is that the state and local taxes that they've paid is $1.2 billion over those 6 years. It's now 8% of the city of Detroit's budget. And they sure need that money coming out of bankruptcy. So some of our conclusions are that the knowledge economy and millennial workforce demands walkable urban places. If you don't provide them, you're not in the knowledge economy. We also found out that Quicken Loans growth which again, back in 2010, they were 7th or 8th in the country as far as their business. They're now number 1. They have 25,000 workers in downtown Detroit. And they're the number 1 loan originator in the country. And this study demonstrated that they would not have achieved that if they had stayed in the business park. They would not have attracted that millennial workforce that they needed. They would not have attracted the knowledge workers. Think back to Dan Gilbert's son, who would not work for him. That these impacts are occurring in both reviving center cities and the urbanizing suburbs, and that the knowledge economy is layering on top of this major industrial area in our country, the metropolitan Detroit area. It doesn't eliminate the industrial, it layers on top of it, but it requires a different infrastructure. It requires different urban policy, and obviously that infrastructure includes rail, bike, pedestrian, as well as car and truck. There's the first rail line built in Detroit, known as Motor City, that the first rail line since the 1950s when they ripped out all of their streetcars, like so many American cities did, that the first rail line was built, opened up last year. It was 100% private sector funded, including Quicken Loans, paying about 10% of the capital cost of that rail line. And the other thing that it demonstrated is how private sector catalytic developers, which Quicken Loans is, buying and rehabbing and filling 100 buildings, 6 million square feet, is a very viable way of turning around these downtowns quickly. It's what I refer to as pushing the fast forward button. So I'd like to end. This is an exhibit that Lisa and I saw yesterday at the Duomo Museum. It's an image that most of us are familiar with of the deindustrialized cities that we contend with in Europe, in the US, elsewhere. This is in Naples, and this image, obviously in black and white, that brings out, that shows the despair of the place. I would urge you to go see it. This is what it's called, Tierra Mala. And this is how we think about our cities, but I think this is a throwback to the industrial age that just happens to hang around, but is being replaced by this, by a vital, walkable urban future. And if I can be so bold as to say something that, and by the way, of these four images, the lower left and upper right are walkable urbanizing suburbs in the US. These were both, one in the lower left is a Bethesda, a suburban town center. The one in the upper right is about 30 miles north of downtown Atlanta, a greenfield development. The one in the upper left, of course, is here. And I'd like to just, my grandfather once told me, tell people what's going to happen or when it's going to happen, but never both. Well, I'm going to violate that because I'd like to talk about what I think the world will be in 2100. How I dodge this is that I'm not going to be around in 2100, so nobody can pin this on me. But I think that we're looking at a far better future than most of us think we are. It's not those black and white images. And here's 5 reasons, there's probably 20 reasons why this is a golden age for humanity. One is that we're going to see the population drop probably to about, well, it's probably going to peak in 2050, 2060, around 9, 10, 11. It'll probably come back to where we are today at about 8 billion on the planet by 2100. Dropping population is crucial. Ideally, we should be back at the 3 to 5 billion range 3 billion is what was on the planet in 1930. Obviously, Africa is key to this, but also immigration is key to this. Because we, in the older societies, Europe, the US, Japan, we're obviously getting older. We need the young people for the vitality to pay for our pensions, quite honestly. So immigration is a must. But there's many hopeful signs out there. As you probably know, the fertility rate, which was at 5.0 children per female back in 1950, it's now down to 2.5. You all know that the fertility rate at 2.1 is, of course, replacement. You here in Europe are much below that. The US is at 1.7 with immigration. Without immigration, we'd be at 1.0. Our family is one example of that Lisa and I, we both got divorced and then we got married, so there's 4 of us that produced 5 offspring. So that's a 2.5 fertility rate. Those 5 offspring are now all married, so there's 10 of them. They've produced 5 kids. That's a 1.0 fertility rate. That's where we're going. And how it's playing out in the macro is that for the first time in probably 500 years, the age cohort between 0 and 15, right now, worldwide, is less than the previous age cohort, that's 16 through 30. That this is a sign that in absolute terms, not just relative terms, in absolute terms, we're going to see a peak shortly. And the most important thing we can do from a climate change point of view is to have fewer of us on the planet, and that's happening. Number 2 is that our density in the US in particular is going to increase dramatically. That we're seeing, as I mentioned earlier, 70, 80, 90% of all new product delivered in real estate is going to walkable urban places. That's less than 5% of our existing land mass. Oh, and by the way, when you move a household from a drivable suburban to a walkable urban location, you cut their greenhouse gas emissions by between 50 and 80%. Number 3 is that from an employment point of view, we will reach net zero as far as emissions. That, again, 10% of us right now in the US are manufacturing and growing our food. And that's becoming highly productive, much more energy efficient. The other 90% are working in the knowledge and in the experience economies that are not energy consumptive. And with increased supply efficiency, we're going to see energy consumption drop precipitously. And number 4, that electricity, which we're shifting most of our new energy needs towards, and particularly in transportation, it's going to be effectively free by 2100. Renewables are amazingly inexpensive. If you own utility stocks right now, sell them. And number 5 is that what we're seeing is the combination of supply efficiency, which most of the environmentalists have been focusing on, but most importantly, what we in this room focus on is demand mitigation. Building places that do not require much energy at all to produce value and economic wealth. Demand mitigation is going to solve 50, 60, 70% of total reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So I think 2100 is a really fine place to be for our grandkids and great-grandkids. Now, so as not to believe that I'm Candide and that we're living in the best of all possible worlds, of course, the big issue is, do we have the time? as we emerge, as we are finding out that the 6th extinction is underway. Do we have enough time to get to 2100? I bet we will. Thank you very much.